Royal Guards usually focus on maintaining a straight face and strictly following protocol. However, from time to time, one of them does something so quietly extraordinary, so stubbornly human, that the entire machinery of royal administration grinds to a confused, blinking halt, and everybody involved walks away having learned something they did not expect to learn. This is one of those stories. And I want to be clear before I begin. I was there, not for all of it, but for enough of it that I feel personally responsible for telling it correctly. My name is Gerald Hutchins. I spent 34 years as a senior administrative officer inside the walls of Buckingham Palace. I have seen state visits. I have managed ceremonial logistics for 3 prime ministers, and I once accidentally addressed a memo to His Majesty using the wrong title and did not sleep properly for 11 days afterward. But in all my 34 years, I never saw anything quite like Lance Corporal Raymond Ose and the door at the end of Corridor 7. Let me tell you about the door first, because the door matters. Corridor 7 is not a corridor that appears on tourist maps. It is not a corridor that appears in any of the glossy official publications about the palace. It runs along the eastern interior of the North Wing, connecting the administrative offices to what was, for many decades, a secondary records room. The ceiling is lower than it should be. The lighting has always been slightly inadequate. There is a persistent smell of old paper and, inexplicably, lavender, which 3 separate facilities managers investigated over 20 years and never satisfactorily explained. At the far end of Corridor 7, there was a door, a plain door, painted the same shade of cream as every other door in that part of the building. It had a brass handle that had been polished so many thousands of times that the engraving on it had almost entirely disappeared. If you knew what it once said, you would understand everything about this story. If you didn't know, it looked like nothing, like every other door, like a door that didn't need guarding. And yet, for as long as anyone in the administrative department could remember, there had always been a guard posted outside it. Not a ceremonial guard. Not the tall, bearskin-hatted figures that tourists photograph on the street. This was an interior posting, a king's guard assigned to stand in a corridor where almost nobody walked, in front of a door that almost nobody noticed, performing a duty that, as far as any current record could confirm, had not been formally reviewed since 1987. In October of last year, the door was officially replaced. Not because anything dramatic happened, not because of a security review or a renovation project. The door was replaced because a junior facilities survey, conducted as part of a routine building assessment, flagged it as structurally inadequate. The original door, heavy, old, slightly warped along the bottom left corner, was removed on a Tuesday morning. A new door was installed by Wednesday afternoon. It was painted the same shade of cream. It had a new brass handle, unengravable and modern. It was, by every official measure, the same door in every way that mattered. Except that it wasn't the same door, and Raymond Ose, I knew it. Raymond had been posted to Corridor 7 4 months before the door was replaced. He was 26 years old. He was originally from Kumasi, Ghana, had moved to Britain with his family at the age of 9, had grown up in Peckham, South London, had joined the army at 18, had served with quiet distinction for 8 years, and had been selected for palace duty the previous spring. He was not, by any external measure, a remarkable young man. His service record described him as reliable, composed, and attentive to detail. His commanding officer had written, in an annual review, that Raymond had an unusual ability to remain present in situations where other soldiers became distracted. It was meant as a compliment. In retrospect, it was a prophecy. Raymond was on duty the morning the old door was removed. He stepped aside, as protocol required, while the facilities team worked. He watched them carry the old door down the corridor. He watched them install the new one. He watched them pack up their tools, check their clipboard, and leave. Then he stepped back into position, in front of the new door. And he did not stop. 3 days passed before anyone noticed. This tells you something important about Corridor 7, that a guard could stand in it for 3 days without anyone thinking to ask why. On the 4th day, a junior administrative clerk named Priya Sharma, 22 years old and 3 weeks into her first palace posting, walked down Corridor 7 by mistake while looking for the photocopier room, saw Raymond standing there, checked her own map, checked it again, looked at the new door, looked at Raymond and said with genuine uncertainty, "Are you supposed to be here?" Raymond looked at her, his expression did not change. "Yes," he said. Priya looked at her map one more time. "The records room was moved," she said, "6 months ago. This door doesn't go anywhere important anymore." "Yes," Raymond said. There was a pause. "So," Priya said. "I'm posted here," Raymond said. And that, in its entirety, was the beginning of what the palace administrative staff would come to call, in hushed and slightly bewildered tones, the Raymond situation. Priya Sharma did what any sensible junior clerk would do. She went back to her desk, wrote a brief internal note flagging a possible administrative oversight in Corridor 7, and sent it to her line manager. Her line manager, a facilities coordinator named Dennis Albright, read the note, frowned at it, and walked down to Corridor 7 himself. Dennis was a practical man. He had worked in palace facilities management for 11 years and believed that most problems had simple explanations, and that the simple explanation was almost always the correct one. He walked up to Raymond with the confident stride of a man who expects to resolve something quickly. "Right," Dennis said, looking at his own clipboard. "The records room was relocated in April. This door was replaced last Tuesday. According to our system, there's no active security posting assigned to this location." Raymond looked at him. "I'm posted here," he said. Dennis looked at his clipboard. He looked at the door. He looked at Raymond. "Who posted you here?" he asked. "My orders," Raymond said. "Your orders from?" Raymond looked at him with an expression of complete, courteous patience, the kind of expression that contains an entire sentence, specifically the sentence, "I have answered this question, and I'm not sure what additional information you're looking for." Dennis wrote something on his clipboard. He went back upstairs. He cross-referenced 3 separate duty rosters, 2 scheduling systems, and 1 handwritten logbook that dated back to 2003. Raymond Osai's name appeared in all of them. The specific posting, Corridor 7, Door 14, appeared in all of them. The authorizing signature was present in all of them. The authorizing signature belonged to a regimental sergeant major who had retired in 2019. Dennis stared at this for a long time. Then he sent an email upward to Senior Facilities Management with the subject line, "Query Corridor 7 guard posting possible administrative anomaly." He was careful to use the word anomaly rather than mistake, because in his experience, calling something a mistake in a palace memo created paperwork that lasted longer than the original problem. The email landed on the desk of Margaret Hollies, head of Senior Facilities Management, who had been in the role for 16 years and had, in that time, developed an almost supernatural ability to identify problems that were going to be significantly more complicated than they first appeared. She read Dennis's email. She read it again. She put it down. She picked it up. She read it one more time. Then she walked down to Corridor 7. Margaret Hollies was a small woman with silver hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, and she had a way of arriving somewhere that made the space feel immediately more organized, as though the room itself straightened up when she entered. She stood in front of Raymond and looked at him the way she looked at budget discrepancies, carefully, without alarm, but with the full weight of her attention. "Lance Corporal Osai," she said. "Ma'am," Raymond said. "You understand that this door was replaced last week?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand that the room behind this door is no longer in active use?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand that the original posting orders for this location were issued under an authorization that is no longer active. Yes, ma'am. Margaret looked at him, then helped me understand. She said, "Why you're still standing here?" Raymond considered this for a moment, not the way someone considers a question they don't know the answer to, the way someone considers how much of the answer to give. "Because nobody told me to stop, ma'am," he said. Margaret Holly stood there for 4 seconds. Gerald counted them later on the corridor security footage because he found it important to know exactly how long it took one of the most experienced administrators in the palace to formulate a response to that sentence. 4 seconds. Then she said, "I see," in the tone of voice that means I do not yet see but I intend to, and she went back upstairs. The emails that followed over the next 72 hours constitute what I consider to be one of the finest collections of institutional confusion ever committed to writing. There were 14 separate email threads. They involved 6 departments. They referenced 4 different regulatory frameworks, 2 of which turned out to be applicable and 2 of which, upon closer reading, applied specifically to naval vessels and had been included by mistake. There were 2 emergency meetings, one of which was canceled and rescheduled, and one of which took place but produced no actionable conclusion beyond the agreement that the situation required further review. Raymond stood in corridor 7 through all of it, perfectly still, perfectly correct. Every hour on the hour, he performed his formal check of the door, handle, frame, hinge, threshold, with the same precise, unhurried attention he had given it every hour since his first day of posting. The new door received exactly the same inspection as the old one. Raymond did not appear to distinguish between them. A palace historian named Dr. Constance Webb was eventually consulted, which is the point at which I personally became involved, because Dr. Webb and I had worked together on 3 separate archival projects, and she called me on a Thursday morning and said, "Gerald, I need you to come and look at something, and I need you to not tell anyone I called you until I know what it is." I went. Dr. Constance Webb had been the palace's in-house historian for 22 years. She was the kind of person who found genuine excitement in handwritten ledgers, and who once spent 4 months establishing the precise provenance of a chandelier. She was also, when she believed something mattered, completely immovable. When she called me that Thursday morning, I could hear in her voice that she had found something that mattered. She had pulled the original installation records for the Corridor 7 posting, not the 1987 records that Dennis had found. The original records, the ones that explained why the posting existed in the first place. She spread them out on her desk when I arrived, 3 documents, old enough that they were stored in acid-free folders, the kind of careful preservation that the palace reserves for things it considers significant. The first was a duty assignment record dated 1953. The second was an internal memorandum dated the same year, stamped with a classification level that had since been downgraded. The third was a single handwritten note, brief enough that I read it twice to make sure I had understood it correctly. In 1953, the room behind the door at the end of Corridor 7 had been used for a specific purpose during the preparations for the Queen's coronation. Sensitive documents had been stored there, not the kind that related to ceremony or logistics, but the kind that related to individuals, personal correspondence, letters that had arrived during an extraordinarily fraught period, and that, for reasons the memorandum described only obliquely, could not be stored in the main archive. The room had been guarded continuously for the duration of their presence. When the documents were eventually moved, the posting had been maintained at the personal direction of a senior official whose name appeared in the record, in handwriting so careful it was almost typographic. The posting had continued through subsequent reviews, not because anyone actively renewed it, but because nobody actively canceled it. It passed from roster to roster, from authorization to authorization, absorbed into the standing orders of successive regiments without anyone pausing long enough to ask the original question. For 70 years, through 13 governments, 4 monarchs, and the complete physical replacement of everything in Corridor 7, except the posting itself, a guard had stood outside that door. Raymond Ose was the latest in a line that stretched back further than his own birth. Constance looked at me across the desk. "He doesn't know any of this," she said. "Are you certain?" I asked. "I asked him," she said. "He told me he was posted there and that his orders were to remain until relieved. He said it as though it were the simplest thing in the world." I thought about this. "Maybe for him it is," I said. Constance picked up the handwritten note and looked at it. "The man who wrote this," she said, "would have been appalled that the posting continued this long for no documented reason." She paused. "He also would have been, I think, quietly satisfied that it did." I asked her what she thought we should do. She said, "I think we should understand what we're looking at before we decide what to do with it." What we were looking at, I came to believe, was something institutions rarely produce accidentally, a moment of genuine, uninterrupted faithfulness. Not faithfulness to a specific order, or a specific person, or a specific document behind a specific door. Faithfulness to the idea that if something was worth guarding once, the burden of proof for stopping should be higher than the burden of proof for continuing. Raymond had not been told why. He had simply been told. And in a world that constantly demands justification for everything, he had stood there and not demanded any in return. I found this, and find it still, one of the most quietly remarkable things I have encountered in 34 years of palace service. But there was still the matter of what the palace was going to do about it. Between the meetings and the memos and the increasingly senior officials who made their way to Corridor 7 and left looking slightly different than when they arrived, Raymond continued his posting with a completeness that I think none of us fully appreciated until we reviewed the security footage afterward. The corridor had 2 cameras. Both had been recording since Raymond's first day. What those recordings showed, across 4 months of footage, was a portrait of a man doing his job with a consistency that was almost meditative, and, in the quiet spaces between official visits, doing something else as well. There was the cleaner, for instance. Her name was Dolores Ferreira. She was 61 years old, originally from Lisbon, Portugal, and had cleaned Corridor 7 every weekday morning for 9 years. In 9 years, she had seen multiple guards come and go. She had learned through experience that most of them preferred to be invisible to her, not unkindly, simply professionally. They were performing a role that required a particular kind of detachment, and acknowledging a cleaner disrupted it. Raymond did not operate this way. The footage showed it clearly from the second week of his posting. As Dolores pushed her cart down the corridor each morning, Raymond would, with an almost imperceptible movement of his head, give her a small nod. Not a greeting in any formal sense. Not a break in his posture or his expression, just a nod. The kind that said, "I see you. You are not invisible here." Dolores, the first time this happened, had visibly startled. She had looked at him for a moment, then looked away, then looked back. Then she had nodded once in return and continued with her work. By the 3rd week, it was a ritual. She would arrive. He would nod. She would nod back. Neither of them ever spoke. The footage across 4 months showed this exchange happening 87 times, 87 mornings, 87 mutual acknowledgments in a corridor where, for 9 years, Dolores had been functionally invisible. When we later spoke to Dolores as part of the administrative review, she described Raymond as, and I am quoting her precisely here, "the only one who ever noticed when I changed my hair." She had cut it shorter in December. Raymond's nod, the morning after, had lasted approximately half a second longer than usual. Dolores had noticed. She had remembered it 4 months later with the clarity of something that had genuinely mattered to her. There were other moments. A lost tourist, an American woman named Barbara, who had somehow navigated past 3 separate checkpoints and arrived, bewildered, in Corridor 7 in late November, asking where the gift shop was. Raymond, without breaking his stance, had said, Left at the top of these stairs, then left again, then ask anyone in a blue lanyard. Barbara had thanked him, then taken a photograph of him, then thanked him again, and then said, "You're doing a great job, honey," in a tone that suggested she meant it as a serious professional evaluation. The corner of Raymond's mouth had moved approximately 2 millimeters in response. The footage confirmed it. There was the afternoon in early December when a pipe in the ceiling above Corridor 7 had developed a minor leak, and maintenance had placed a small yellow caution sign on the floor 6 feet from Raymond's post. Raymond had looked at the sign. He had looked at the ceiling. He had looked at the sign again. Then he had, with great deliberateness, adjusted his position by precisely 18 inches to the right, close enough to remain at his post, far enough that he was no longer standing directly under the drip. He had then stood there for 3 hours until the maintenance team arrived to fix the pipe, at which point he had moved back to his original position with the same deliberateness. Nobody had asked him to move. Nobody had told him to. He had simply made a quiet, practical decision, and then returned to exactness the moment exactness was restored. And then there was the moment I find most difficult to describe, without feeling something shift in my chest. It was a Wednesday evening in January. The corridor was empty. Dolers had gone home. The maintenance team had completed their checks. The administrative day was over, and Corridor 7 was, for all practical purposes, a quiet stretch of inadequately lit hallway containing 1 man and 1 door. The security footage showed Raymond standing perfectly still, as he always did. Then, at 6:47 in the evening, he turned his head very slightly to the left toward the door. He looked at it for approximately 5 seconds. Then he turned back to face forward. And for just a moment, just 1 moment, on footage that has now been reviewed by 4 separate people who have all independently mentioned it, his face did something that his face was not supposed to do during operational hours. His face said, "I know this matters even if I cannot explain why." And then his face was still again. I have watched that 6 seconds of footage more times than I am comfortable admitting. I watch it because I think it contains something true about what it means to take something seriously in a world that has largely stopped requiring seriousness of anyone. Raymond was not performing. There was nobody watching. There was only Raymond and the door and a corridor that smelled, inexplicably, of lavender, and a sense of occasion that Raymond apparently carried with him, regardless of whether the occasion could be verified by any current administrative record. He was 26 years old. He had been standing in that corridor for 4 months, and on a quiet Wednesday evening, with no audience and no expectation, he had looked at the door he had been told to protect and confirmed to himself, silently and privately, that protecting it was the right thing to do. Phase 5, the palace finally understands. The formal review of the Raymond situation was conducted by a panel that included Margaret Hollies, Dr. Constance Webb, a regimental colonel named Thomas Abernethy, a legal advisor whose name I have been asked not to include, and myself, in an unofficial consultative capacity that Margaret had arranged by the simple method of adding my name to the meeting agenda without telling me first. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. I will not reproduce the entirety of it, partly because some elements remain administratively sensitive and partly because the middle 40 minutes, which concerned the regulatory framework governing standing orders that have outlasted their original authorizing officer, were genuinely very difficult to follow, and I am not certain I understood them even in real time. But the beginning and the end of that meeting are worth describing. Colonel Abernethy opened by laying out the formal position with military precision. The posting was technically unauthorized under current standing orders. The door no longer guarded anything of documented active sensitivity, and the correct administrative action was to relieve Lance Corporal Ose of the posting and ensure proper records were updated to prevent recurrence. He said this clearly and without cruelty, and everything he said was correct. Then Dr. Webb laid out what she had found in the archive. The room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something changes the frame of a conversation entirely. Abernethy listened without interrupting, which in my experience of him was itself significant. He asked 2 questions, both precise, both practical, and then he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "So he's been continuing a posting," Abernethy said slowly. "That was originally established for a reason that still, arguably, carries weight, just not in any living person's operational memory." "That is a fair summary," Constance said. "And he has been doing this without knowing any of that history." "Without knowing any of it." Abernethy looked at the ceiling for another moment. "Right," he said, in the tone of a man who has just reclassified something in his mind. "Right." The legal advisor offered 3 possible courses of action. The first was immediate relief of posting, with standard administrative notation. The second was a formal review and potential reinstatement of the posting under properly documented authority. The third, which the legal advisor introduced with the careful tone of a person who has already decided they personally find it compelling, was a hybrid approach. Relieve the posting, document the historical context fully, and acknowledge the service formally and specifically, rather than simply moving on. It was Margaret Hollies who said what I think all of us were thinking. She said it in her typically direct way, without preamble, and without any of the softening language that palace memos usually require. "We should not pretend," she said, "that what this young man did was an administrative oversight that we need to correct. What he did was maintain a standard that the institution itself had lost track of. The least we can do is say so clearly to his face before we do anything else." Nobody disagreed. They sent for Raymond. He arrived at the meeting room 12 minutes later, still in his guard uniform, still carrying himself with the particular quality of stillness that I had come to think of over the preceding weeks as specifically his. He stood at the door of the meeting room and waited to be addressed. He did not appear nervous. He did not appear uncertain. He appeared, as he always appeared, entirely present. Colonel Abernethy spoke first. He told Raymond that his posting at Corridor 7 was being formally reviewed. He told him that the review had uncovered historical documentation that placed the posting in a context that none of them had initially understood. He told Raymond that the panel wished to acknowledge, formally and on record, that his conduct during the posting, his consistency, his attentiveness, and specifically his decision to continue in the absence of any instruction to stop, had reflected the highest standards of his regiment and of palace service. Raymond stood and listened. He said nothing until Abernethy had finished. Then he said, "Thank you, sir," in the tone of a man receiving information rather than a compliment. Abernethy looked at him for a moment. "Is there anything you'd like to say, Lance Corporal?" Raymond thought about this. Not for long, but genuinely. The real consideration of a man deciding whether to speak or remain quiet, and choosing to speak. "I want to ask about the door, sir," he said. Abernethy waited. "The original door," Raymond said. "The one they removed, do you know where it went?" The room was quiet for a moment. This was not a question anyone had considered. Margaret Hollies very quietly wrote something down. "I don't know," Abernethy said. "We can find out." "I'd like to know," Raymond said, "if that's possible." He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. Every person in that room understood, I think, that Raymond was not asking out of sentiment or curiosity. He was asking because in his understanding of the posting, the door was not incidental. The door was the point. The new door was a door. The old door was the door. And whatever it had witnessed, whatever it had absorbed over 70 years of being stood in front of by people who were told it mattered and believed it, Raymond wanted to know that it had not simply been discarded. Margaret Hollies tracked it down 3 days later. The original door had been taken by the facilities team to a storage depot in the palace grounds, a large, Climate-controlled space where items of potential historical interest are held pending assessment. It had not been destroyed. It had not been repurposed. It was sitting in the depot, still in its original condition, still bearing the almost invisible remnants of its engraved handle. When Constance Webb went to examine it, she discovered that the engraving, while largely worn away, could be partially read under raking light. 3 words, old enough that the typeface was no longer standard, clear enough that the meaning was not in doubt. She photographed it and sent me the photograph. I looked at it for a long time. The 3 words read, "Handle with care." Epilogue: What Gerald thinks about. Standing in corridor 7 one last time. My last day of palace service was a Friday in March. I had arranged to leave quietly, no gathering, no speeches, which is how I had always preferred things. I handed in my access credentials to the security desk, collected my personal items from my office, and walked out the way I had walked in every morning for 34 years. But before I left, I walked down to corridor 7. Raymond was no longer posted there. The formal review had resulted in the posting being officially suspended pending full historical documentation, a process that Constance has assured me will be completed with the seriousness it deserves, and which will result in a proper, authorized decision about whether the posting should be restored, rather than the administrative fog through which it had survived for 7 decades. Raymond himself had been reassigned to a standard ceremonial posting at the front of the palace. His regimental sergeant major had told him, as part of the handover, that his conduct record had been formally annotated with a commendation, not a medal, not a ceremony, but a written recognition that would follow him through the remainder of his service and beyond. Raymond had said, "Thank you, sir," in the same tone he used for everything, and had gone to his new post. I walked to the end of corridor 7 and stood in front of the new door. The cream paint, the modern handle, the faint smell of lavender that had still, somehow, not been explained. I stood there for perhaps 2 minutes, not because I was guarding anything, not because I had been told to, but because I wanted to understand, for just a moment, what it felt like to be the person who stayed. And here is what I found. It is very quiet in corridor 7, quieter than most places in the palace, which is itself quieter than the city around it. In that quiet, standing in front of a door that leads to a room that no longer holds anything of formal significance, I found that the act of standing there created its own kind of significance. Not the significance of protecting something valuable, the significance of treating something as though it might be. The significance of not being the person who decided, without full information, that the careful attention of 70 years was no longer worth the trouble of 1 more hour. Raymond Ose had stood in this corridor for 4 months without knowing the history behind him. He had stood through reviews and inquiries and increasingly senior visitors, each of whom had arrived expecting to find confusion and left finding something they did not entirely have words for. He had nodded at a cleaner 87 times. He had directed a lost tourist to the gift shop. He had moved 18 inches out of the rain and 18 inches back when the rain stopped. He had looked at a door on a quiet Wednesday evening and confirmed to himself, with no audience at all, that it still deserved his attention. None of this will be in any official history of the palace. Corridor 7 will not appear on any map. The door at the end of it will not have a plaque. But the original door, the old door, the one with the almost invisible engraving, is now in the palace archive under Constance Webb's care. Catalogued, preserved, handled with care. It is, she tells me, one of the oldest continuously guarded objects in the building, and the only one whose most recent guardian never knew that was what it was. Raymond Osei, Lance Corporal, 26 years old, King's Guard, the young man who protected a door that nobody told him to stop protecting, and who, in doing so, protected something much older and quieter and more important than any of the people who came to correct him were initially looking for. I retired on a Friday, I walked out through the main entrance. I did not look back. But I thought about Corridor 7 for the whole drive home. And I think I will think about it for a long time after that. Duty without understanding is blind, but duty with understanding, even when the world has stopped explaining itself, is something else entirely. It is the quiet decision to take something seriously because once someone else did. And that is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. Gerald Hutchins, March